After my wife passed away, my two sons received her penthouse, a $15 million commercial real estate company, and a luxury yacht. I, the man who built the very foundation of that wealth, was handed a small, crumpled envelope. Everyone in the room laughed at me as I opened it. Inside was nothing but a one-way plane ticket to France and a strange, heavy brass key. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally gotten rid of the senile old man. But when I arrived in Nice, a driver was waiting for me with a sign. When he handed me a letter from my late wife, my entire world collapsed, and their perfect little empire was about to burn to the ground. Before I continue this story, please let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth. The cold, sterile air in Richard's law office felt heavy and suffocating. My wife Diana had been dead for exactly 2 weeks. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of building a life together, reduced to a stack of legal papers resting on a polished mahogany desk. Richard, our estate lawyer for the past decade, closed the thick leather binder. He cleared his throat and nervously adjusted his glasses, completely unable to meet my eyes. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the room. Then the laughter started. It was a low, mocking chuckle, at first coming from my youngest son, Declan. He was 38 years old, dressed in a custom-tailored Italian suit paid for by the company I helped create. Next to him, my oldest son, Preston, who was 42, leaned back in his plush leather chair and let out a full, triumphant laugh. Preston had just inherited the entire Caldwell real estate empire. $15 million worth of commercial properties, development contracts, and liquid assets, all handed over to him in a single breath. Declan was awarded the 70-foot luxury yacht moored in Miami and the massive Chicago penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. They were set for life. They were now the kings of an empire they did not build, and me. I sat there in my simple gray suit, my calloused hands resting on my knees, waiting. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, slightly crumpled manila envelope. He slid it across the polished wood toward me. It looked like an afterthought. A piece of trash accidentally mixed in with the multi-million-dollar property deeds. "That is for you, Victor," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at the envelope, then at my sons. Preston was smirking, nudging his wife, Monica, who sat next to him, with a look of barely concealed pity. I picked up the envelope. The paper was rough. The seal was stamped with dark red wax. I broke the seal and tipped the envelope over my hand. A heavy vintage brass key clattered onto the table, followed by a piece of thick cardstock. It was a plane ticket. A one-way business class ticket to Nice, France, departing in exactly 2 days. There was no property deed. There was no check. There was no explanation. Just a ticket to get me out of the country and a key that looked like it belonged to an old cellar door. Declan could no longer contain himself. He burst into loud laughter, slapping his knee. "A plane ticket," he gasped out. "She left you a vacation." Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The smugness radiating from him was physically nauseating. He looked at me not as a father, but as a minor inconvenience that had finally been dealt with. "Mom knew you were getting senile, old man," Preston said, his voice dripping with arrogance and condescension. "She knew the business was just too much for you to even comprehend anymore. Take a vacation. Go drink some cheap wine in France and leave the real work to the people who actually have the brains to manage it." He stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. "Do not worry, Dad. We are not completely heartless. We will set up a monthly transfer for you. $1,000 a month for your allowance. That should be plenty for a retired old man to buy coffee and crossword puzzles." Monica placed a manicured hand over her heart, leaning in with a sickeningly sweet smile. "It really is for the best, Victor. You have been looking so tired and confused lately. Preston has been running everything anyway. Let us handle the heavy lifting from now on. You just go and rest. I sat there gripping the armrests of my chair. My jaw was clenched so tight, my teeth ached. $1,000 a month. A forced vacation. They were speaking to me as if I were a clueless, pathetic burden. As if I had not spent the last 4 decades shedding my own blood to put those expensive suits on their backs. They saw a quiet 70-year-old man who spent his time reading on the porch and tending to the garden. They conveniently forgot the man I used to be. My mind flashed back to the bitter winters 40 years ago. Before the luxury penthouse. Before the yacht. Before the $15 million empire. I remembered the bone-chilling cold of the Pennsylvania coal mines. I remembered working 16-hour shifts, breathing in toxic black dust until my lungs burned just to put food on the table. Diana had a dream back then. She wanted to buy a dilapidated property, fix it up, and sell it for a profit. But we had absolutely nothing. The banks laughed at us and showed us the door, so I went down into the mines. I worked double shifts, destroying my back and permanently scarring my hands, saving every single penny until I handed her the $10,000 she needed for her very first real estate flip. I was the foundation of this family. I was the solid bedrock that Diana built her empire upon. When the company grew, I voluntarily stepped back. I let her take the spotlight because she was the brilliant negotiator, the charismatic face of the business. I managed the complex logistics in the shadows, quietly keeping the gears turning while raising our 2 boys. And this is how they repaid me. By treating me like an unwanted stray dog, being sent away so they would not have to look at me anymore. I stared at Richard the lawyer. He rapidly looked down at his notes, refusing to make eye contact. He knew this was wrong. He had drawn up these papers. Why did Diana do this? Just 6 months ago, we were sitting in our living room sipping tea and she looked me right in the eye. Victor, she had said, her voice clear and strong, when I am gone, 60% of the company is yours. You hold the controlling stake. Keep the boys in line. That was her solemn promise to me. So what happened in the last few weeks of her life? When the cancer had aggressively spread to her brain, when she was heavily sedated on an endless drip of morphine, someone had gotten to her. Someone had guided her weak hand to change the will. I looked directly at Preston. His eyes were cold and calculating. He had orchestrated this entire circus. He had manipulated his dying mother to steal my life's work and throw me out on the street with nothing but a plane ticket. But I did not scream. I did not flip the heavy mahogany table or lunge at the throats of my ungrateful sons. If my decades in the cutthroat background of corporate operations had taught me anything, it was that anger is a massive weakness when it is loud, but a lethal weapon when it is quiet. I picked up the brass key. It was incredibly heavy, the cold metal pressing against my palm. I looked closely at the dark red wax seal on the torn envelope. It was the Caldwell family crest. Diana had officially stopped using that specific wax seal 30 years ago. Why on earth would she use it now? My gut violently twisted. My instincts, honed over decades of survival and business warfare, began to scream at me. Diana was a genius. She never did anything without a very specific, calculated reason. This envelope was not a cruel dismissal. This was a message. I smoothly slid the heavy key and the plane ticket into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I stood up slowly, deliberately, making sure to play the exact part they expected of me. I slouched my shoulders, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh, portraying the exhausted old man they thought I was. I suppose you are right, Preston, I said, keeping my voice soft and letting it tremble just slightly. I am very tired. France sounds nice. Preston smirked widely, exchanging a victorious, arrogant look with Declan. They thought they had won the war. They thought they had successfully buried me without a fight. But as I turned and walked out of that sterile law office, my grief morphed into something cold and terrifying. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with, and I was going to let them celebrate right up until the moment I tore their stolen empire to the ground. I stared at Richard, the man who guarded our family trust for a decade. The brass key and plane ticket burned in my pocket. I kept my face impassive. "Richard," I said, my voice cutting the air. "Diana and I sat in our living room 6 months ago. She stated clearly I would retain a 60% controlling stake in Caldwell Real Estate. You drafted that document. When was this new will signed?" Richard swallowed hard, refusing to meet my gaze. "The document was revised during the final week of her life, Victor," he muttered. "It is entirely legal now." The cancer ravaged her brain, keeping her submerged under a continuous morphine drip. My sons brought Richard into her hospital room when I was sent home. They guided her frail hand to sign away 40 years of our shared sweat. Before I could demand to see the competency evaluations, a manicured hand rested on my arm. It belonged to Monica Preston's wife. She painted a look of fabricated sorrow across her powdered face. "Dad, please." Monica cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Do not make this harder than it already is. Diana did this only for you. She just wanted you to rest. You are 70 years old. You cannot handle the stress of an empire anymore. Preston runs everything behind the scenes anyway. Let us handle the heavy lifting. Mom wanted you to have peace." Peace. The word tasted like ash. They packaged their absolute greed as an act of mercy. They wanted me to believe my calculating wife suddenly decided to strip her loyal husband of his entire life savings out of pity. I looked at Monica. I looked at Preston, who failed to hide a smirk, and then at Declan texting on his phone. I knew better than to argue. Arguing with thieves only gives them the satisfaction of your desperation. I nodded slowly. I stood up, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out of the law office without saying another word. Let them think they won. Let them think the old man was broken. I drove through Chicago, heading for the penthouse. The residence overlooking the skyline Diana and I purchased a decade ago when the company struck gold. It was the home where we planned to spend our final years. I parked in the garage and took the private elevator up. I stepped into the foyer and walked to the oak doors. I reached for the keypad to enter my code. I pressed the familiar sequence. A harsh red light flashed. Access denied. I paused, assuming I pressed the wrong button. I typed the numbers again. Another red flash. A sharp beep confirmed the rejection. My access code had been wiped. My heart beat with a slow rhythm as I noticed something stacked in the shadows of the service hallway. I walked over, the motion sensor lights flickering on to reveal a brutal sight. 6 black plastic garbage bags sat there. They were piled haphazardly against the concrete wall. Beside them were 2 cheap cardboard boxes. I knelt down and opened the top of the nearest box. Inside were my clothes hastily shoved together. My winter coats, my reading glasses, the framed photographs from my nightstand. They had not merely locked me out. They had bagged up my existence like discarded rubbish. I pulled back the plastic of the second bag. Something sharp caught my finger. I reached in and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside lay my original steel drafting compass and my vintage architectural protractor measuring tool inside. These were the exact tools I used 40 years ago, before the $15 million real estate empire, before the luxury yachts and tailored suits. These were the tools I used to design the very first modest home Diana and I ever owned, sitting at a wobbly kitchen table while she calculated our meager savings. These tools represented the absolute foundation of our family. My sons tossed them into a trash bag to be hauled to the dump. I told the maids to pack the heavy stuff first, a voice echoed through the hallway. I stood up slowly right then, brushing the dust from my trousers. I watched Declan walk out from the service elevator. I was wearing a tailored blazer and holding a cup of coffee. He stopped a few feet away, surveying the pile of garbage bags with absolute indifference. He did not look at the drafting tools in my hand. He only looked at his expensive watch. "I see you found your luggage," Declan said, taking a casual sip. I was going to have the staff bring it down to the lobby, but I figured you would want to say a proper goodbye to the service hallway. I looked at my youngest son, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose private university tuition I paid in full with the money I earned, breaking my back in the construction industry before the company took off. You changed the security code, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. Declan scoffed, leaning against the wall. Of course I changed the code. The penthouse is officially in my name now. Mom left it to me. I cannot have unauthorized people wandering in and out of my private residence. I stared at him, feeling the absolute weight right now. Unauthorized people? You mean your father, the man who purchased this property? Declan rolled his eyes, annoyed by my lack of gratitude. Do not do the guilt trip thing, Dad. It is pathetic. The deed belongs to me. Actually, you are lucky you came by today to grab your junk. I have a demolition crew coming in tomorrow morning at 8 sharp. They are going to completely gut the master suite and tear down the walls of your old bedroom. He gestured vaguely toward the oak doors. I am turning that entire wing into a private home gym this week, and a simulation golf room. The current layout is incredibly dated. He spoke about destroying the bedroom I shared with his mother, as if he were discussing a minor landscaping project. He did not care about the memories. He only cared about the square footage. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $50 bill, and tossed it onto the nearest garbage bag. You fly out to France tomorrow anyway, Declan said, turning toward the elevator. There is a cheap motel near the airport. That cash should cover a cab ride and a diner burger for you. Grab your bags and get out of my hallway before I have security escort you out. He stepped into the elevator. The steel doors slid shut, leaving me alone in the silent corridor. I looked down at the $50 bill resting on the black plastic bag containing my life. I looked at the heavy brass key hidden safely in my pocket. My sons believed they had thoroughly humiliated me. They believed they had stripped me of my power, my dignity, and my home. They were convinced I was a weak man who would simply disappear, but they were wrong. I gathered the plastic bags from the cold concrete floor. I carried them to my car without shedding a single tear. I drove through Chicago, leaving the towers behind. I found a motel near the airport, the kind of place Declan sneeringly suggested. The neon sign flickered. I paid in cash and carried my discarded life up the stairs. The room smelled of stale smoke and harsh cleaning chemicals. Thin curtains barely blocked the streetlights. I dumped the bags onto the mattress. I did not sit down to weep. I untied the knots, intending to salvage whatever dignity remained. I reached into the second bag containing my old architectural tools. As I pulled out the wooden box holding my compass, a manila folder slipped out. The folder did not belong to me. It bore the Caldwell Real Estate logo. Preston must have hastily swept a side table into the bags, accidentally mixing his paperwork with my possessions. I opened the folder. Inside were standard operational reports, meaningless memos, and a glossy brochure for a luxury car dealership. I was about to toss the pile into the wastebasket when a small torn slip of paper caught my eye. It was wedged between two financial summaries. I pulled it out. It was a receipt printed on cheap thermal paper, but the numbers written on it were staggering. I adjusted my reading glasses and moved closer to the dim yellow light of the lamp. The document was a promissory note detailing wire transfers amounting to millions of dollars. But the lender was not a legitimate commercial bank. It was a holding company I recognized from my early days working construction in the rougher parts of the city. It was a notorious front for a black market lending syndicate, a group of ruthless individuals specializing in off-the-books loans with crippling interest rates. My mind raced. Why would the chief executive officer of a thriving $15 million commercial real estate empire need to borrow money from dangerous loan sharks? Preston had unrestricted access to prime corporate credit lines. He had the backing of major financial institutions. Yet here was concrete proof he was bypassing the legal banking system to secure shadow capital. A cold realization began to creep into my veins. The opulent suits, the luxury yachts, the constant boasting. It was all a hollow facade. The company was not thriving. It was hemorrhaging cash, and Preston was desperately trying to plug the holes with dirty money. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning beneath my weight. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out the crumpled envelope Richard had handed me. I smoothed out the rough paper. Beside it, I placed the heavy brass key and the one-way plane ticket to France. I had initially assumed this was merely a cruel joke, a final insult orchestrated by my greedy sons, but Diana was not a cruel woman. She was a brilliant, meticulous strategist. During our 40 years together, she never made a single move without calculating the outcome 10 steps in advance. If she truly believed I was losing my mind, she would have placed me in a comfortable care facility, not banished me across the Atlantic Ocean with a vague plane ticket and an antique piece of metal. I picked up the envelope again and ran my thumb over the broken wax seal. It was dark red, almost burgundy. In the sterile environment of the law office, I had barely glanced at it. Now, under the harsh light of the motel lamp, I studied the intricate impression left in the wax. It was a shield flanked by 2 intertwining oak branches, the old Caldwell family crest. My breath caught in my throat. 30 years ago, when we first incorporated our real estate business, Diana had a custom wax stamp made with that exact crest. She used it for our very first official contracts before locking it away. She told me the crest was a symbol of our humble beginnings, a private reminder of the days when we had nothing but each other and a shared dream. She had not used that stamp in 3 decades. My sons would not know the significance of that crest. Preston and Declan were too young, too arrogant, and entirely too self-absorbed to recognize an old family relic. They probably thought the lawyer used it to make the document look official. But I knew better. Diana deliberately chose that specific stamp. She sealed this envelope herself, bypassing the legal team, bypassing the fraudulent revisions of the will. She was sending me a message, a breadcrumb hidden in plain sight. I picked up the brass key. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and completely unique. It did not belong to any door in our Chicago penthouse or any of the corporate offices. The ticket was for a flight to Nice, a city on the French Riviera, where we had never owned property, at least to my knowledge. Everything clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Diana did not betray me on her deathbed. She did not sign away my life savings out of pity. She knew exactly what Preston and Declan were doing. She knew about the shadow loans. She knew the company was being hollowed out by their reckless, criminal greed. And she knew that if she openly confronted them, they would find a way to silence her, or worse, frame me for their financial crimes. She had played the senile, dying mother perfectly. She allowed them to believe they had successfully manipulated the will. She let them inherit the company because she knew the company was a sinking ship. She was getting me out of the blast radius. I stood up, the fatigue completely vanishing from my bones. The grief that had been suffocating me for 2 weeks was suddenly replaced by a sharp, burning focus. My sons thought they were dealing with a broken, discarded old man. They thought I was sitting in this miserable room, crying over my lost fortune, waiting for a flight into exile. I gathered my coat. I did not need to sleep. I needed proof. The torn receipt was a start, but I needed the full picture before I boarded that plane. I knew Preston kept his most sensitive physical ledgers locked in a private vault at corporate headquarters. He assumed I no longer had access to the building. But I was the one who personally oversaw the installation of the security network 20 years ago. I knew the master override codes, codes that Preston in his supreme arrogance had never bothered to change. I walked out of the motel room, leaving the plastic garbage bags on the bed. I stepped into the cool night air and got back into my car. The engine roared to life. I steered the vehicle away from the airport and headed back toward the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. The city was asleep, but my war was just beginning. I was going to walk right into the absolute heart of their entirely stolen empire and uncover the rot they were trying so desperately to hide. The drive from the cheap motel back to the downtown commercial district took exactly 20 minutes, but my exhausted mind covered entire decades. I slowly pulled into the desolate underground parking garage of the Caldwell corporate headquarters. The massive glass and steel structure towered above me. It was a monument to 40 years of relentless labor now occupied by parasites. My sons had undoubtedly updated the primary security systems. They installed biometric scanners at the front doors and new keycard protocols for the elevators. They thought they had effectively locked me out of the building I purchased, but they were ignorant of history. When Diana and I bought this building 25 years ago, it was a crumbling shell. I personally oversaw the extensive renovations. I worked directly with the architects and the structural engineers. Because of that, I knew every single hidden vein and artery of this structure. I bypassed the brightly lit lobby and walked to a heavy, unmarked steel door in the loading dock alleyway. It was the old freight maintenance entrance. I flipped open the small, weatherproof cover of the keypad. The modern digital locks upstairs were integrated into a centralized computer network. This keypad, however, was hardwired directly into the building's original analog grid. It was an emergency override I insisted on keeping functional for the maintenance crew. I wiped the dust from the buttons and punched in a 6-digit code, the birth date of my late wife. The heavy locking mechanism clicked with a satisfying metallic thud. I pulled the door open and stepped into the darkness. I carefully navigated the labyrinth of concrete service corridors, using only the dim emergency lights. My footsteps made no sound on the polished floors. I was a ghost haunting my own castle. I bypassed the main elevators and took the executive service stairwell up to the top floor. My heart pumped a steady rhythm of adrenaline. At 70 years old, I was tired, but the sheer force of betrayal fueled every single step. I reached the 14th floor and gently pushed open the stairwell door. The plush carpeted hallway of the executive suite stretched out before me. The area was completely silent, except for a faint murmur of voices coming from the main boardroom at the far end of the corridor. A thin sliver of golden light spilled out from underneath the heavy mahogany double doors. I crept closer, pressing my back against the cold, textured wall just outside the room. I slowed my breathing, listening intently. The distinct sound of clinking crystal glasses echoed through the heavy wood. They were celebrating. "I have to admit, Richard," Preston was saying, his voice loud and brimming with arrogant triumph, "I genuinely thought the old man was going to put up a fight. I thought he was going to demand an audit of the estate." Someone chuckled. It was Declan. "Did you see his face when you handed him the plane ticket? He looked completely shattered. He is probably crying in some cheap airport motel right now, packing his little bags." I clenched my fists in the shadows, fingernails digging deeply into my palms. Then I heard the lawyer speak. Richard sounded nervous, entirely lacking the confident bravado of my sons. "We are not entirely clear yet, Preston. The probate process is highly scrutinized. The revisions we made to your mother's will were executed at the absolute last minute. If your father suddenly decides to hire independent legal counsel to contest the mental competency evaluations, this entire arrangement could fall apart." A sharp clink of glass hitting a wooden table interrupted him. "He is not going to hire anyone." Preston snapped, his tone suddenly aggressive and cold. "He does not have the money, and he does not have the spine. He is leaving the country tomorrow. Now listen to me very carefully. I need you to file the final transfer papers tonight, Richard. I need absolute legal control of the remaining liquid assets before the markets open tomorrow." Richard sighed heavily. Preston rushing the filings could trigger automated flags. If the federal authorities are currently monitoring these specific bank accounts right now. "Do it tonight," Preston interrupted, his voice rising to a vicious hiss. "File the transfer papers tonight, Richard, before the IRS or the old man smells the rot." The word hung in the silent hallway. Rot. The air in my lungs suddenly felt thick and suffocating. My mind violently jerked back to the early days of our marriage. I remembered sitting at a battered kitchen table in a tiny apartment, the weak overhead light casting long shadows across stacks of invoices. It was 3 in the morning. Diana was beside me, rubbing her tired eyes, meticulously balancing the ledgers down to the very last penny. We had just purchased our first small commercial property, and we were terrified of failing. We tracked every single nail, every can of paint, every hour of contracted labor. I remembered her looking up at me, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes burning with absolute determination. "We build this on solid rock, Victor," she had whispered, gripping my calloused hand. "No shortcuts, no dirty money. We build an honest foundation, or the whole thing will eventually rot from the inside out." We spent 40 years building an immaculate, deeply respected enterprise. We paid our taxes early. We treated our contractors with total fairness. We forged a pristine reputation in the vicious world of commercial real estate. And now the boy we had raised, the son who had been handed a golden kingdom on a silver platter, was standing in the boardroom I built, calling my life's work rot. The torn receipt from the black market lending syndicate burned like a branding iron in my pocket. The pieces of this horrifying puzzle finally snapped together. Preston was not just an arrogant, ungrateful son throwing a tantrum. He was a desperate criminal trying to cover his tracks. He had secretly leveraged the pristine assets of Caldwell Real Estate to secure massive shadow loans. He had plunged the company into unimaginable debt. The mention of the Internal Revenue Service confirmed my absolute worst fears. They were not merely evading taxes. They were systematically laundering dirty money through our legitimate corporate accounts. The $15 million empire was nothing but a hollowed-out shell propped up by illegal debt and fraudulent ledgers. Diana had discovered their catastrophic crime. She knew the federal government was slowly closing in on the company. If she had left the controlling stake to me as she originally intended, I would have been held legally responsible for the massive financial fraud committed by my own children. She had changed the will to ensure Preston and Declan absorbed the entirety of the legal liability. I stood completely still in the dark hallway, my breathing slow and steady. I did not need to break down the door. I did not need to scream at them. I turned around and silently walked back toward the stairwell, fading into the shadows like a ghost. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, but they forgot who built the board. The morning sun pierced through the thin, stained curtains of my motel room, casting a harsh light over the plastic bags that held my discarded life. I had not slept a single minute. My mind had spent the entire night mapping out the exact dimensions of the betrayal. Preston and Declan were laundering dirty money, dragging the pristine name of Caldwell Real Estate through the mud to feed their insatiable appetites for luxury. They had manufactured a massive toxic debt, completely convinced that their old, gullible father would quietly take the fall while they sailed away on their yacht. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the muted television screen. In the past, a father might have marched into that corporate office, flipped over the boardroom table, and demanded answers. I might have yelled until my lungs gave out, begging them to explain how they could look me in the eye while digging my grave. But confronting them now would be a monumental mistake. They had lawyers like Richard on their payroll. They had the resources of a $15 million company, or whatever illusion of it remained at their immediate disposal. If I showed my hand, if I gave them even the slightest indication that I knew about the shadow loans and the tax evasion, they would panic. They would instantly destroy the physical ledgers, wipe the digital servers, and initiate whatever contingency plan they had prepared to pin the blame squarely on my shoulders. I needed to act like the exact person they believed I was. I needed to be the exhausted, defeated patriarch who had finally surrendered. I picked up my mobile phone from the cheap laminate nightstand. I took a deep, steadying breath, consciously slowing my heart rate, and dialed the private number for Preston. It rang 3 times before he answered. He sounded breathless, energetic, completely full of himself. He was probably already sitting behind the custom mahogany desk of Diana, spinning around in her expensive executive chair. "Preston," I said, letting my voice crack just a fraction, injecting the perfect amount of weariness into my tone. "I am sorry to call you so early in the morning." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, wondering if I was about to ask for the penthouse back. "Dad," he replied, his voice shifting into that patronizing, overly patient tone he used when speaking to me. "It is fine. We are just extremely busy here today. A lot of transitions happening. What do you need?" I gripped the edge of the mattress, my knuckles turning white while keeping my voice soft and hesitant. "I just wanted to call and say that you are right. You are absolutely right, son. I spent the entire night thinking about everything. I am simply too old for this. The stress, the business, the grief over your mother. It is all too much for me now." I paused, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "I am taking the flight to France today. I am going to take that vacation. I just want you to take care of the legacy of your mother. Protect the company." Preston let out a loud, highly exaggerated breath of relief. The sheer arrogance radiating through the phone was almost palpable. "I am really glad you finally see reason, Dad. This is exactly what Mom wanted for you. A quiet life away from the heavy burdens. Do not worry about a single thing here. Declan and I have the entire operation completely under control. We are taking Caldwell Real Estate into a whole new era." I could hear movement in the background, a door opening, the distinct clack of expensive high heels on hardwood floors. It was Monica. "Is that your dad?" I heard her ask in the background, her voice muffled but perfectly clear to my trained ears. "Did he finally pack his bags?" Preston chuckled softly, covering the receiver with his hand, but not well enough. "Yeah, the old man is officially tapping out," Preston whispered to his wife. "He is heading to the airport now. We got everything. Total control. The transition is completely done." I listened to my daughter-in-law let out a joyful, triumphant squeal. She was celebrating the complete theft of my life. Preston returned his mouth to the phone, clearing his throat to regain his fake professional composure. "Listen, Dad. I have an important board meeting I need to prepare for right now. Have a safe flight to Nice. We will call you in a few weeks when things settle down here. Enjoy the wine." He did not wait for my response. He hung up the phone. The line went dead, leaving me listening to the hollow dial tone. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The hesitant, defeated posture I had adopted instantly vanished. I sat up perfectly straight. My face felt completely cold, devoid of any warmth, any sorrow, any remaining trace of paternal affection. They were popping champagne and celebrating my surrender. They believed they had outsmarted the man who had spent 4 decades navigating the most treacherous corporate waters in the country. They thought they had secured their ill-gotten wealth, assuming their crimes would remain permanently buried under my name. I placed the phone back on the nightstand. The anger I felt was no longer a fiery, uncontrollable rage. It had crystallized into something incredibly sharp, precise, and highly dangerous. I stood up from the bed and walked over to the plastic garbage bags they had so generously provided for my eviction. I did not need the bulky winter coats or the heavy photo albums right now. I reached into my travel bag and packed only the absolute essentials: a clean change of clothes, my passport, my financial identification documents, and the small wooden box containing my original drafting tools. I carefully placed the torn promissory receipt I had found the night before into a secure, waterproof folder. Then I picked up the thick manila envelope Richard had given me. I traced my thumb over the broken wax seal of the Caldwell crest one last time. I took out the business class plane ticket to France and the heavy vintage brass key. I slipped the key into my front pocket, feeling its reassuring weight against my leg. I was not boarding this plane to quietly fade away into obscurity. I was not leaving the country to run away from my ungrateful children or hide from the grief of losing Diana. I was traveling to France to follow the trail my brilliant wife had secretly laid out for me. I walked out of the cheap motel room, leaving the door wide open behind me. I tossed the room key on the front desk and walked out into the cool morning air. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and started the engine. The drive to the international airport was quiet. I watched the skyline of Chicago fade in the rearview mirror. My sons thought they had successfully sent me into permanent exile. They were completely unaware that they had just given me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I was not packing for a vacation. I was packing for a war. The early morning traffic in Chicago was light, giving me plenty of time to navigate the gray mist-covered streets. I took a deliberate detour through the industrial district on the south side of the city. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a 24-hour diner that looked completely abandoned to the untrained eye. This was a place far removed from the polished glass towers and luxury penthouses where my sons spent their stolen wealth. I parked my car in the darkest corner of the lot, grabbed the waterproof folder containing the torn promissory receipt, and walked toward the glowing neon sign. I pushed open the glass door. The bell chimed a metallic note. The diner was mostly empty save for two tired truck drivers at the counter and a waitress wiping down a table. I walked past them, heading straight for the booth in the far back corner, hidden away from the windows and the prying eyes of the street. Sitting there nursing a cup of black coffee was Leon Graves. Leon was a man carved from granite. He was 65 years old, bald, and possessed a gaze so sharp it could cut through a steel vault. Decades ago, Leon was the forensic accountant in the state of Illinois. He worked for the federal government, tearing apart the financial ledgers of corrupt politicians and organized crime syndicates. But 25 years ago, he made a catastrophic mistake. He dug too deeply into the wrong cartel. They framed him for embezzlement, froze his assets, and put a bounty on his life. Diana and I stepped in when the world turned its back on him. We hid him in one of our remote properties, funded his legal defense, and eventually proved his innocence. We gave him his life back when he was standing on the precipice of ruin. Leon never forgot that debt. He retired from the public sector shortly after, operating only in the shadows for a select group of clients. I slid into the booth across from him. He did not smile. He simply nodded, his dark eyes analyzing my demeanor. He could read a room just as easily as he could read a balance sheet. He knew something was wrong. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I reached into my coat and slid the waterproof folder across the table. Leon opened it. He pulled out the receipt I had found stuffed among my discarded clothes. His eyes scanned the numbers and the name of the holding company. I watched his jaw tighten. He recognized the syndicate immediately. "Preston," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He has mortgaged the company. He is pulling shadow loans from the black market." Diana discovered it before she passed away. She changed her will to leave the company to him and Declan, legally insulating me from the impending fallout. Leon looked up, his expression hardening into a mask of anger. "They are washing dirty money through your clean accounts, Victor," Leon said, his tone serious. "This syndicate does not just loan out cash for struggling businesses. They use legitimate corporate structures to launder their profits. If Preston brought them in, Caldwell Real Estate is functioning as a massive washing machine. The Internal Revenue Service will tear the company down to the studs." I nodded, feeling the cold reality of the situation settle over the table. "They think I am leaving the country to retire in shame," I told him. "They think I am a senile fool who surrendered his legacy without a fight. They bagged up my personal belongings and threw me out into the service hallway. They changed the security codes on the penthouse." I reached into my pocket and placed a burner phone on the table next to the receipt. Beside it I placed a small piece of folded paper containing a string of numbers. Those are the master analog override codes for the corporate network, I explained. I wired them into the basement mainframe 20 years ago. Preston never updated the hardware down there. He only polished the executive suites upstairs. Leon picked up the piece of paper, a predatory smirk breaking through his stoic expression. He lived for this kind of warfare. "What do you want me to do, Victor?" he asked, pocketing the phone and the codes. I looked him dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of betrayal and focus I possessed. "I want you to dig into the corporate accounts while I am in the air, Leon. I want you to follow the shadow money down to the very last cent. Break their firewalls. Download every fraudulent contract, every hidden ledger, and every illegal transfer they have made over the last 2 years. I need undeniable proof of their crimes." Leon took a sip of his coffee. "Preston has installed sophisticated digital alarms on the primary servers," he warned. "If I trigger one, he will know someone is inside the system." I shook my head. "You will not trigger them because you are going to use the analog access points. You will be a ghost in the machine. By the time they realize their data has been cloned, I will be thousands of miles away, completely out of their reach." Leon tapped the folder against the table. "Consider it done. I will have the financial structure mapped out before your flight lands in Europe. What is the end game, Victor?" I leaned back against the seat. "We let them hang themselves. We gather the rope and we wait for the perfect moment to drop the floor out from under them." I stood up from the booth, leaving a $20 bill on the table. "If anything goes wrong, burn the phone and walk away. Do not put yourself in danger for this." Leon scoffed quietly. "Nothing is going to go wrong, my friend. Have a safe flight. Leave the digital bleeding to me." I turned and walked out of the diner, stepping back into the misty Chicago morning. I got back into my car and drove the rest of the way to the international airport. The traffic grew heavier as the city slowly woke up, completely oblivious to the silent war being waged in its shadows. I pulled into the long-term parking garage and grabbed my travel bag. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the terminal, the bright fluorescent lights washing over me. I moved through the security checkpoints with the quiet, unassuming posture of an elderly tourist. No one paid me any real attention. I was invisible exactly as I needed to be. I found my gate and sat in a quiet corner, staring out the massive windows at the planes lined up on the tarmac. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Preston, an automated alert showing he had successfully assumed total executive control of the company. I simply swiped the notification away. I handed my ticket to the attendant and walked down the jet bridge. As I stepped onto the aircraft, I felt the heavy brass key pressing against my leg. The trap was now officially set. The terminal of the Chicago airport was a sprawling cavern of glass and steel filled with the roar of hurried conversations. I walked past the duty-free shops and crowded coffee stands, making my way to the quietest corner of the business-class lounge. I found a secluded leather armchair facing the windows that looked out onto the gray runway. I sat down, placing my travel bag on the empty seat beside me. I pulled out my laptop and opened the screen. The device connected to the encrypted cellular hotspot I purchased earlier that morning. I did not want to leave digital footprints on the public airport network. My mind was completely clear. The shock of the betrayal had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating determination. Preston and Declan believed they had stripped me of my legacy. They thought the $15 million corporate empire was the only thing of value I possessed. They were foolish. While Diana and I built Caldwell Real Estate into a success, I always maintained strict financial boundaries. I never forgot the brutal lessons I learned working in the Pennsylvania coal mines and grueling construction sites. I knew empires could crumble overnight. I knew true security was quiet, hidden, and deeply personal. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to my private banking portal. I typed my credentials and answered the secondary security questions. the dashboard loaded displaying accounts my sons knew absolutely nothing about. Over the last 4 decades, long before the luxury penthouses and 70-foot yachts became a reality, I had been quietly funneling a portion of my personal earnings into a private pension fund and a diversified stock portfolio. Diana knew about this money. We explicitly agreed to keep it completely separate from the corporate ledgers and our joint marital assets. It was our ultimate safety net, an untouchable reserve designed to protect us if the real estate market ever suffered a catastrophic collapse. Because these accounts were registered solely under my name and predated the formation of our primary corporate holding company, they were completely exempt from the probate process surrounding the revised will of my late wife. Preston and his lawyer Richard had no legal jurisdiction over these funds. They had no idea this money even existed. I navigated to the investment tab. The portfolio was incredibly healthy, built on 40 years of disciplined market choices. I clicked the button to initiate a total liquidation of my private stocks and mutual funds. A warning prompt appeared on the screen asking me to confirm the transaction and warning me of the potential tax implications of selling everything at once. I did not hesitate. I typed my final authorization code and confirmed the sale. The system processed the request, converting decades of careful investments into raw liquid cash. Next, I moved to my primary pension account. I initiated an early total withdrawal. The bank would certainly take their penalties, but I did not care about the minor losses. I needed every available dollar completely disconnected from the American financial system before Leon triggered the inevitable federal raid on Caldwell Real Estate. Once the funds were fully consolidated into my primary checking account, I opened a second highly encrypted browser window. I accessed the secure portal of a private wealth management firm located in Geneva, Switzerland. I had established this offshore trust 5 years ago as a potential vehicle for international investments. I initiated a direct international wire transfer, moving the entire liquidated sum from my domestic bank directly into the untouchable Swiss account. I watched the progress bar slowly fill across the screen. The transfer was authorized. In a matter of minutes, I quietly moved several $1 million across the Atlantic Ocean, completely vanishing from the reach of my greedy children. I took a slow sip of the bottled water, sitting on the table next to me. The heavy lifting of my financial preservation was officially complete. But there was still one minor piece of business left to attend to. I navigated back to my domestic banking portal and clicked on the section managing my personal credit lines. For the past 3 years, I had maintained 2 ultra-premium black cards. I had originally authorized Preston and his wife Monica as secondary users on these specific accounts to cover genuine corporate emergencies or unexpected travel expenses related to the business. I pulled up the recent transaction history for those cards. The sheer audacity of their spending was staggering. Over the last month alone, while my wife was dying in a hospital bed, Monica charged over $15,000 at high-end designer boutiques and luxury spas. Preston used the card to book private helicopter charters and reserve tables at exclusive multi-thousand-dollar dinner clubs. They were using my personal credit as their own private slush fund to finance their arrogant lifestyle, confident that the clueless old man would simply continue paying the massive bills without asking questions. They had mistaken my quiet generosity for foolish ignorance. I calmly opened the secure account management settings on my screen. I selected the secondary user profiles for Preston and Monica. With a single click of my mouse, I permanently revoked their authorization and canceled both black cards. I pictured the exact scenario unfolding later this afternoon. Monica would attempt to purchase another ridiculous designer handbag, only to have her card declined in front of her superficial friends. Preston would try to cover the tab at his exclusive country club, only to face the utter humiliation of a rejected payment. It was a petty move, but incredibly satisfying. I closed the banking portal and wiped the browsing history from my laptop. I shut the computer and placed it back into my leather travel bag. I looked out the massive window of the lounge. The ground crew was finishing preparations on the large passenger jet, waiting at the gate. Moments later, the overhead intercom chimed with a soft, melodic tone. The gate agent announced the final boarding call for the business class passengers on the flight to Nice, France. I stood up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The crushing weight of the betrayal and the suffocating grief over the loss of my wife had been entirely replaced by a singular, razor-sharp purpose. I grabbed the handle of my travel bag and joined the short line of passengers at the gate. I handed my boarding pass to the attendant. She scanned it, smiled politely, and wished me a very pleasant flight. I nodded my thanks and walked down the enclosed jet bridge toward the aircraft. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, heavy brass key Diana had left for me. I did not know exactly what was waiting for me inside that mysterious vault in France, but I knew my brilliant wife had orchestrated a masterpiece. As I stepped onto the plane and made my way toward my seat, a grim, genuine smile finally broke across my tired face. Preston and Declan thought they had sent me away to die in quiet obscurity. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their stolen empire straight to the ground. The heavy thrust of the jet engines pushed me back into my leather seat as the aircraft severed its ties with the American soil. I watched the sprawling grid of Chicago shrink into a meaningless patchwork of gray blocks through the small oval window. Preston and Declan were down there somewhere within that concrete maze, blindly celebrating a victory that had already been dismantled. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue glow, signaling our ascent into the quiet sanctuary of the stratosphere. I lowered the window shade and settled into the quiet isolation of the business class cabin. The steady hum of the flight enveloped me, acting as a pressure cooker for my racing thoughts. I was suspended miles above the earth, entirely trapped in a pressurized metal tube for the next 8 hours. There was absolutely nothing more I could physically do but wait. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. I laid it flat on the pristine white linen of my tray table. The metal was cold and tarnished with age, completely unlike the sleek modern keycards my sons obsessed over. It was an antique, heavy, and purposeful. Diana had placed this artifact into an envelope sealed with our original crest, trusting my memory to decode her final message. I stared at the intricate grooves cut into the brass shaft. They were the physical manifestation of a master plan she had been secretly engineering for months, right under the noses of the very children who thought they were manipulating her. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the pieces of the past year began to rapidly assemble in my mind. The narrative of her cognitive decline had been flawlessly executed. I remembered the first time Diana supposedly forgot the name of our lead structural engineer during a major quarterly review. Preston had immediately swooped in, placing a condescending hand on her shoulder, smoothly taking over the presentation. I had felt a profound, suffocating sadness that day, watching my brilliant wife stumble over simple corporate details. Now, sitting in the quiet cabin, I realized it was a magnificent performance. She was actively testing their greed. She was giving them enough rope to hang themselves. The sudden shifts in her personality, the bouts of fabricated confusion, the deliberate misplacement of important files. It was all a calculated smokescreen. She had intentionally created the illusion of a vulnerable senile matriarch to completely lower the defenses of our sons. But the most brilliant move occurred exactly 8 months ago. We were sitting in the solarium of our penthouse when she suddenly demanded a total legal separation of our private marital bank accounts. She was fiercely adamant, borderline paranoid, insisting that our personal pension funds and private stock portfolios be immediately disconnected from the Caldwell real estate corporate umbrella. I had argued with her for hours, utterly confused by the sudden demand. I had foolishly attributed her frantic insistence to the worsening symptoms of her supposed dementia. I had eventually signed the separation documents just to bring her peace of mind. Now the sheer genius of that moment struck me with the force of a physical blow. She was not acting out of paranoia. She was actively severing our true wealth from a sinking ship. She knew Preston had secretly mortgaged the corporate assets to a shadow syndicate. She knew the company was being hollowed out from the inside. By legally untethering our private funds, she had effectively built an impenetrable fortress around our life savings, ensuring that when the federal authorities finally raided Caldwell Real Estate, they could not touch our personal accounts. She had saved my life while I was busy pitying her fading mind. A wave of mild turbulence rattled the cabin, pulling me back to the present moment. The crystal glass of sparkling water on my tray table vibrated softly. The physical shaking of the aircraft mirrored the turbulent anxiety churning in my stomach. I opened my laptop and powered it on. I connected to the expensive, notoriously unreliable wireless internet network provided by the airline. The connection icon flickered, struggling to maintain a signal as we soared over the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I needed to hear from Leon. The trap was set, my personal funds were secure in a Swiss vault, and the black cards were cancelled, but I needed the exact dimensions of my son's catastrophic failure. I opened my encrypted messaging application and stared at the empty chat window. The minutes stretched into hours. The other passengers around me slept soundly beneath heavy blankets, completely ignorant of the financial warfare unfolding across the digital hemisphere. I constantly refreshed the screen, watching the small loading circle spin in endless loops. The internet connection was deteriorating the further we flew from land. I felt a sudden spike of panic. If Leon could not breach the analog servers before the morning shift arrived at the corporate headquarters, Preston might discover the intrusion. If Preston realized someone was cloning the shadow ledgers, he would immediately initiate a total data wipe. The entire plan hinged on Leon moving faster than my arrogant sons. I rubbed my tired eyes, feeling the exhaustion of a sleepless night, finally attempting to claim my focus. I refused to close my eyes. I stared at the brass key resting on the linen cloth, letting its quiet weight anchor my determination. Diana had fought her battle in complete silence, surrounded by the sterile walls of a hospital room, playing a dangerous game of deception until her very last breath. I owed it to her to see this through to the absolute end. I would not allow her legacy to be tarnished by the reckless criminal behavior of the boys we had raised. I would burn the corrupted company to the ground to honor the honest foundation she had originally built. The airplane dipped slightly, navigating another patch of rough air over the open ocean. A digital notification warned me that the onboard wireless signal was about to drop completely due to satellite repositioning. I had only a few minutes of connectivity remaining. I aggressively tapped the refresh key on my keyboard. Nothing happened. The screen remained perfectly blank. I closed my eyes, taking a long, deep breath to steady my racing pulse. I mentally prepared myself for the agonizing reality of waiting until I landed in France to discover if Leon had successfully breached the network. Just as my finger hovered over the power button to shut the machine down, a sharp, distinct chime echoed from the small speakers of my laptop. A single message appeared in the encrypted chat window. The sender was completely anonymous, but I instantly recognized the blunt, uncompromising cadence of Leon Graves. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The text message hit me with devastating force. It read, "Victor, the company is not bleeding. It is already a corpse. Preston has 40 million in illegal debt." The sheer magnitude of that horrifying number was paralyzing. The airline network severed, dropping my connection entirely. I was left completely alone in the dark sky. Trap closed. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a restless blur. I sat in the dim cabin, the weight of Leon's message heavy on my chest. $40 million in illegal debt. My sons had not simply mismanaged the company. They had driven it straight into an abyss. As the morning sun broke over the horizon, the aircraft began its slow descent over the sparkling azure waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The picturesque coastline of the French Riviera came into view, a stark contrast to the cold, gray reality I had left behind in Chicago. The wheels touched down on the tarmac of the Nice airport, jolting me back to the immediate present. I gathered my travel bag and joined the flow of passengers disembarking the plane. I walked down the jet bridge expecting to navigate the chaotic customs terminal and find a local taxi. Instead, a uniformed airport official was waiting at the end of the corridor, holding a small placard with my name discreetly printed on it. He gave a polite nod and guided me through a private, expedited security checkpoint reserved for foreign diplomats and high-net-worth individuals. The glass doors slid open, leading not to the main terminal, but directly out onto a restricted section of the sunlit tarmac. Waiting there, gleaming under the bright coastal sun, was a sleek, midnight black Mercedes Maybach. The vehicle was armored, the thick, bulletproof glass slightly tinted to obscure the interior. Standing beside the open rear door was a sharply dressed driver in a tailored navy suit. He stood with a perfectly straight posture, exuding an air of quiet, professional authority. As I approached, he offered a deep, respectful bow. "Welcome home, Monsieur Caldwell," the driver said, his English accented with a smooth native elegance. "My name is Antoine. Madame instructed me to wait for your arrival." I froze, staring at the man. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt as heavy as a lead weight. Diana had orchestrated this entirely. She had secured an armored vehicle and a private driver in a foreign country, anticipating this exact day. I nodded silently and slid into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. Antoine closed the heavy door with a solid muffled thud, instantly isolating us from the noise of the airport. He took his place behind the steering wheel and guided the massive car out of the private aviation sector. We merged onto the winding coastal highway. The pristine waters of the Mediterranean stretched out to my right, glittering like crushed diamonds. To my left, the rugged sun-baked hills of southern France rolled past in a blur of green and gold. I sat back against the incredibly soft leather, my mind struggling to process the massive paradigm shift. Yesterday morning, I was standing in a dingy motel room, surrounded by black plastic garbage bags, believing my entire life had been unceremoniously discarded. Now, I was being chauffeured through one of the most exclusive regions on Earth. "Antoine," I said, breaking the quiet ambience of the cabin. "How long have you worked for my wife?" Antoine adjusted his grip on the leather steering wheel, his eyes glancing at the rearview mirror. "For nearly a decade, monsieur," he replied smoothly. "Madame Caldwell was a highly valued client. She possessed a remarkable vision. She secured my services and the management of the estate precisely 9 years ago." 9 years. My breath caught in my throat. 9 years ago, our Chicago real estate firm had just recorded its most profitable quarter in history. It was the exact moment Preston had officially joined the executive board. Diana had seen the creeping rot of our sons long before the actual decay began. She had quietly started building a fortress, an ocean away entirely outside the jurisdiction of American courts and the greedy reach of her own children. The Maybach turned off the busy coastal highway and began a steep winding ascent up a private tree-lined mountain road. The wrought iron gates of neighboring villas grew increasingly grand and heavily fortified the higher we climbed. Finally, Antoine slowed the vehicle as we approached a massive stone wall completely covered in climbing ivy. 2 towering steel gates, reinforced and equipped with multiple high-definition security cameras, stood blocking our path. Antoine pressed a button on the console. The heavy gates swung open smoothly, revealing a long, sweeping driveway paved with crushed white gravel. The tires crunched rhythmically as we drove through a dense grove of ancient olive trees. Then the trees cleared, and my heart completely stopped. Before me stood a sprawling, majestic 10-acre chateau. It was a masterpiece of classic French architecture, featuring pale stone facades, tall arched windows, and slate-gray roofs. Meticulously manicured gardens cascaded down the hillside, in precise geometric patterns leading toward a massive infinity pool that seemed to drop directly into the Mediterranean Sea far below. This was not merely a vacation home. It was a fortified compound of unimaginable wealth. I had spent 40 years evaluating prime commercial properties. I knew the market deeply. Just from a cursory glance at the acreage, the structural integrity, and the prime location on the Riviera, I could accurately calculate the value. This estate was easily worth $80 million. It was a towering monument to absolute financial supremacy. Antoine halted the Maybach at the grand entrance. Wide sweeping stone steps led to solid oak doors. I stepped out of the vehicle, the warm coastal breeze carrying the scent of sea salt and blooming lavender. I stood entirely motionless, absorbing the sheer scale of the deception. Preston and Declan were back in Chicago, popping cheap champagne and ruthlessly stabbing each other in the back for control of a dying, debt-ridden, $15 million corporate shell. They believed they had successfully stolen the kingdom. They had absolutely no idea this real empire existed. They were fighting over scraps of rotting meat, while Diana had quietly secured the entire feast. She had funneled the true, untainted profits of our early successes into international trusts and untraceable foreign assets, purchasing this absolute fortress to protect our genuine legacy from their criminal incompetence. I walked up the stone steps, my footsteps echoing against the ancient walls. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the antique brass key. I approached the heavy oak doors. There was no modern digital keypad, no biometric scanner to manipulate. There was only a single heavy brass lock. I inserted the key. It fit with absolute satisfying perfection. I turned it to the right, and the heavy internal tumblers clicked into place. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside the grand foyer. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, fractured light over polished marble floors. A profound sense of peace washed over me immediately, followed by an intense, burning resolve. I was no longer a victim, waiting for the federal government to freeze my accounts. I was a king standing inside an impregnable castle. Let Preston file his fraudulent transfer papers. Let him assume total control of a $40 million black market debt. He built his own guillotine. I walked inside ready for war. The grand foyer of the chateau was breathtaking, but I had no time to admire the imported marble or the priceless tapestries hanging on the ancient stone walls. Antoine closed the heavy oak doors behind us, instantly sealing away the sound of the ocean wind. The silence inside the estate was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of my previous life in Chicago. Antoine gestured respectfully toward a wide, sweeping staircase. He did not speak. He simply led the way, his leather shoes making no sound on the thick, woven runners. I followed him up to the second floor, passing rows of portraits and antique mirrors that reflected the face of a man who had just survived a shipwreck. We walked down a long corridor lined with tall, narrow windows overlooking the sprawling Mediterranean coastline. The sunlight warmed my face, but my mind remained sharply focused on the brass key resting heavily in my pocket. Antoine finally stopped at the very end of the hallway before a set of unassuming solid walnut doors. There were no ornate carvings here, no gold handles. It looked like a simple utility closet or a secondary guest room. Antoine pulled a small silver remote from his tailored suit jacket and pressed a single button. A hidden electronic mechanism clicked, and the heavy walnut doors unlocked. He pushed them open and stepped aside, bowing his head slightly. I stepped past him and crossed the threshold into a hidden, climate-controlled study. The air inside was cool, crisp, and distinctly filtered, smelling faintly of old paper and polished leather. The room was surprisingly modern compared to the classic French architecture of the rest of the chateau. Thick, soundproof panels covered the walls. A sleek glass desk sat in the center of the room, facing a massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. But it was not the books that commanded my attention. It was what sat precisely in the center of the back wall. Built directly into the reinforced concrete was a massive antique bank vault. It was a beautiful, imposing beast of dark iron and polished brass, a relic from an era when security relied on physical mass and flawless engineering rather than digital firewalls. The steel door was easily a foot thick, adorned with complex interlocking gears and a heavy spoked wheel. It looked entirely out of place in a Mediterranean villa, yet absolutely perfect for a woman who trusted no one with her most precious secrets. I slowly approached the vault, my heart hammering a steady rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. This was the exact destination Diana had prepared for me. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the heavy vintage brass key. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while liquidating my entire personal fortune thousands of miles above the Atlantic Ocean, suddenly began to tremble. I took a deep breath, forcing my nerves into submission. I stepped directly in front of the massive iron door. I located the primary keyhole hidden subtly beneath a sliding brass plate. I inserted the key. It slid into the chamber with a smooth, oiled resistance. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the key and turned it to the right. A deep, resonant clack echoed through the silent study, a sound of heavy tumblers falling perfectly into place. I reached out and grasped the large spoked wheel in the center of the vault door. I pulled downward. The wheel rotated smoothly, engaging the massive locking bolts hidden inside the iron frame. With a low metallic groan, the heavy steel door released its seal. I pulled it open. The sheer weight of the door required a substantial effort, but it swung outward on perfectly balanced hinges, revealing the dark, secure cavern within. The interior lighting of the vault flickered on automatically, casting a bright clinical glow over the contents. I stood completely frozen, my breath catching in my throat, as I finally witnessed the absolute magnitude of my wife's secret masterpiece. The vault was not merely a safe. It was an organized archive of unimaginable wealth. Stacked neatly on the top shelf were thick banded bundles of European bearer bonds. I recognized the distinct watermarks and the dense, intricate printing. These were unregistered, highly liquid financial instruments entirely untraceable by the American banking system or the Internal Revenue Service. There were tens of millions of dollars sitting casually on a single shelf. On the second shelf lay a series of thick, leather-bound folios. I reached out and opened the first one. Inside were original notarized property deeds. I flipped through the heavy parchment pages. There were deeds for commercial high-rises in London, residential apartment complexes in Berlin, and a sprawling vineyard in the south of Italy. Diana had not just hidden cash. She had quietly built an entirely separate, fully functional European real estate empire, completely insulated from the toxic, fraudulent mess Preston had created back in Chicago. She had siphoned the legitimate, untainted profits from our early decades of hard work and systematically invested them across the Atlantic, far away from the greedy, incompetent reach of our children. My sons were currently fighting a vicious losing battle over a collapsing company buried in $40 million of black market debt, completely unaware that their mother had safely relocated the true Caldwell fortune into an impenetrable fortress. My eyes drifted to the center shelf of the vault. Resting alone on a velvet display pad was a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name, Victor, was written across the front in a familiar, elegant script. I picked it up. The paper was heavy and expensive. I broke the simple wax seal and pulled out a thick stack of handwritten pages. The ink was dark, crisp, and fresh. There were no tremors in the penmanship, no disjointed sentences, no signs of the cognitive decline she had so convincingly performed for the last 12 months. I unfolded the pages and began to read. The tone was sharp, fiercely lucid, and entirely devoid of the tragic dementia she had faked. "My dearest Victor," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means my final performance was a success and you have safely navigated your way to our true home. I know you are angry. I know you felt betrayed when Richard read the revised will. I know the pain of my silence must have been agonizing for you. For that I am deeply, profoundly sorry. But I needed you to genuinely believe the lie so that Preston and Declan would believe it too. I needed your grief to be real, your shock to be absolute, because our sons have become dangerous, unpredictable men. Victor, the company you built with your bare hands is dead. Preston mortgaged our pristine reputation to a violent shadow syndicate. He accumulated $40 million in illegal debt to fund his pathetic, shallow lifestyle. When I discovered the fraudulent ledgers 8 months ago, I knew the federal authorities were not far behind. If I had left the controlling stake to you, the government would have frozen all your assets, and the syndicate would have come for your life. It started 2 years ago. The letter continued, her elegant cursive pulling me deeper into the horrifying reality she had navigated alone. I noticed small discrepancies in the quarterly tax filings. Nothing that would alert a standard auditor, but you and I built those books, Victor. I knew our cash flow better than my own heartbeat. Preston was routing minor commercial renovation budgets through phantom shell companies, disguised as overseas material suppliers. At first I thought he was merely skimming off the top to fund a new sports car or a lavish vacation for Monica. But as I quietly dug deeper into the hidden digital archives he thought were secure, the absolute magnitude of his betrayal became terrifyingly clear. He and Declan were not just stealing from us. They were using Caldwell real estate as a massive washing machine for organized crime. I gripped the heavy parchment racing across her words. Our beautiful $15 million empire is entirely gone, my love. It is nothing but a toxic liability now. Over the past 2 years, Preston secretly leveraged every single building, every prime commercial lot, and every ounce of corporate goodwill we possessed. He mortgaged our pristine reputation to a violent shadow syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard. He accumulated $40 million in illegal off-the-books debt to fund his pathetic, shallow lifestyle and keep his dangerous new partners satisfied. The company is completely hollowed out. It is a rotting corpse painted gold to fool the public. The calculated precision of her investigation astounded me. She had mapped their entire criminal enterprise while sitting quietly in her hospital bed. When I fully uncovered the fraudulent ledgers, I also realized something far more dangerous. The Internal Revenue Service was already circling. Federal agents have been quietly building a massive criminal audit for the last 14 months. The indictments are completely inevitable. The collapse is coming, Victor, and it will be spectacular, brutal, and entirely merciless. I wanted to scream. Diana wrote a dark smudge of ink, betraying the intense emotion behind her steady hand. I wanted to march into the boardroom and tear our sons limb from limb for what they had done to our life's work. But I knew the brutal truth. If I confronted them openly, they would panic. They had structured the shadow loans and the tax evasion algorithms so deeply into the central corporate mainframe that the liability was completely diffused. I knew that if I fought them, they would corner you. They would expertly frame you, my honest, trusting husband, as the mastermind behind the entire criminal syndicate. The government would have eagerly frozen all of your personal assets, and the cartel would have eventually come for your life to silence you. A tear slipped down my cheek and hit the floor. I could see her face in my mind, weighing the impossible choices before her. So I made the only logical decision, the letter continued. I played the senile old fool. I knew I had to give them total, unrestricted legal control of the entire sinking ship. I had to make sure their names, and only their names, were on the final executive transfer documents when the federal authorities finally kicked down the doors. I faked the cognitive decline. I faked the sudden memory lapses. I endured those agonizing neurological exams, deliberately failing simple memory tests, while the doctors shook their heads in pity. I swallowed my immense pride every single time Declan spoke to me, as if I were a confused, burdensome child. It was the hardest performance of my entire life, Victor. Do you know how much it broke my heart to look at you with blank eyes? The vulnerability in her words pierced straight through my chest. Do you know how much strength it took to pretend I did not remember the day we opened our first office or the day we bought our first modest home? I saw you mourning the loss of my mind, and I could not comfort you. I could not whisper the truth in the dark, because Preston had installed listening devices in the penthouse. I had to let you believe I was slipping away. I had to let you believe our ungrateful sons were winning all so I could keep you absolutely safe from the blast radius. I lowered the pages, gasping for air in the quiet climate-controlled study. My brilliant, fearless wife had sacrificed her own dignity to build a firewall around my life. While I was holding her frail hand weeping over her fabricated dementia, she was executing a flawless extraction plan. She had used her terminal illness as the perfect cover story to quietly move our legitimate, untainted capital across the Atlantic Ocean, purchasing the bearer bonds, the European property deeds, and this breathtaking coastal fortress. I changed the will at the absolute last minute to ensure you inherited absolutely nothing of the American corporation, she wrote. By legally disinheriting you, I severed your legal connection to the $40 million debt and the impending federal indictments. Preston and Declan were so blinded by their absolute greed and their desperate need to control the remaining liquid assets that they eagerly signed their own death warrants. They inherited a burning house, Victor, and they locked the doors from the inside. The money in this vault, the real estate deeds in the portfolios beneath this letter, this is our true legacy. This is the clean, honest capital we built over 40 years, completely untraceable by the American banking system, and entirely out of the reach of our criminal sons. I secured Antoine and this property to give you a sanctuary. You do not have to fight for your survival anymore. You are a king, my love. You are protected, you are wealthy, and you are completely untouchable. Do not shed another tear for Caldwell Real Estate. The final paragraph concluded her handwriting, growing slightly fainter, reflecting her fading physical strength. Let the federal agents tear the Chicago towers down to the concrete. Let the shadow syndicate collect their debts from the boys who thought they could outsmart the world. You gave them everything, Victor. You gave them love, education, and every opportunity to be good men. They chose to be thieves. Let them face the brutal consequences of their own destructive actions. Live your beautiful life in the warm sun. Walk through the ancient olive groves and know that I am walking right beside you. I have loved you since the very day we had absolutely nothing, and I will deeply love you long after the dust ultimately settles. Yours forever, Diana. I carefully folded the parchment papers and held them against my chest. The utter silence of the antique vault wrapped entirely around me like a comforting, warm embrace. The profound grief that had heavily anchored me for weeks was instantly incinerated by a blinding sense of total awe. Diana had not just protected me from ruin. She had brilliantly armed me for absolute victory. I lowered the first page of the heavy parchment, my hands trembling as the sheer magnitude of her brilliant deception washed over me. I moved to the second page. Her elegant cursive handwriting continued painting a picture of a silent, agonizing war she had fought entirely in the shadows. You must understand the precarious timeline I was working against, my love. The letter read. Preston had become incredibly paranoid. He was aggressively insulating his shadow syndicates within our primary corporate holding accounts. He thought he was building an impenetrable fortress of dirty money. But he forgot one fundamental truth. He forgot who originally built the structural foundation of Caldwell Real Estate. He forgot that I possessed the absolute master ledger. I pictured her sitting up late at night in our Chicago penthouse, the city lights reflecting in her sharp eyes, while she pretended to be confused and fading during the day. For 24 consecutive months, I systematically dismantled our true wealth, she explained. I knew I could not simply transfer massive sums of capital out of the primary American accounts without triggering his digital alarms or alerting his crooked legal team. So I bypassed the domestic banking system entirely. I utilized the international escrow accounts we established 3 decades ago. I slowly, methodically siphoned every single dollar of our clean, legitimate profits out of the United States. I liquidated our untainted overseas development bonds. I cashed out our private equity portfolios. I diverted the original clean dividend streams before they ever reached the corrupted Chicago mainframe. My eyes traced the lines of ink, completely mesmerized by her sheer financial genius. She had executed a flawless extraction right under the noses of men who believed they were financial masterminds. Every single dollar I secured was quietly funneled into a sovereign European private trust, she wrote. A trust I established exclusively in your name, Victor. Preston and Declan have absolutely no legal jurisdiction over these specific funds. They have no paper trail, no digital footprint, and no possible way to contest the transfer because these specific assets were legally separated from the primary holding company long before I allowed them to rewrite my final will. I looked up from the letter for a brief moment, staring at the thick bundles of bearer bonds and the extensive property deeds resting inside the massive iron vault. This was not just a safety net. This was the entire uncorrupted essence of our 40 years of labor, distilled and purified. I left them the crown victor, but I took all the jewels. Her words continued on the page. Preston and Declan fought tooth and nail to inherit Caldwell real estate. They ruthlessly humiliated you, they insulted our legacy, and they aggressively maneuvered to take absolute control of the American holding company. I gave them exactly what they demanded. I handed them the keys to a completely hollow, rotting shell. The beautiful poetry of her vengeance sent a sharp thrill down my spine. The $15 million empire they believe they currently control is a toxic liability, Diana revealed. It is completely riddled with $40 million in unpayable syndicate debts. But the danger is not just financial, my love. The danger is imminent and highly physical. 6 months ago, I anonymously forwarded a heavily encrypted dossier of Preston and his illegal shadow banking transactions to the federal authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division have been quietly building a massive, comprehensive case against our sons and their criminal associates. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the next sentence. The federal raid on the Chicago corporate headquarters is scheduled to happen within the next 48 hours. The government is going to completely seize the building, freeze every single domestic bank account, and arrest the entire executive board. If you had remained in the United States, if you had retained your 60% controlling stake as we originally planned, you would have been the primary target. The federal agents would have dragged you out of our penthouse in handcuffs. The syndicate would have targeted you to recover their lost millions. You would have spent the rest of your natural life rotting in a federal prison for crimes you never committed, while Preston walked away completely clean. I suddenly understood the brass key. I understood the abrupt, seemingly cruel eviction. I understood the one-way business class ticket to France. The flight to the Mediterranean was not an exile, Victor. It was an emergency extraction. She wrote, her tone shifting into a deeply emotional register. I needed to get you entirely out of federal jurisdiction before the storm finally broke. I needed you safely, an ocean away, physically standing inside this impregnable fortress, when the FBI finally kicked down the doors of Caldwell Real Estate. I had to break your heart in that lawyer office so I could ultimately save your life. I had to let you believe I was a fragile, failing woman who had betrayed her beloved husband. Tears blurred my vision, spotting the thick cream paper. She had carried this monumental burden entirely alone. She had suffered through the agonizing humiliation of pretending to lose her brilliant mind. She endured the endless patronizing insults from the children she had birthed, all while meticulously building a golden parachute to carry me away from the impending explosion. Do not mourn the loss of the Chicago towers, the letter instructed firmly. Do not shed a single tear for the ungrateful boys who chose absolute greed over family loyalty. They are about to face the terrifying consequences of their own monstrous arrogance. They will be locked in federal cells, stripped of their stolen wealth, and hunted by the very shadow lenders they foolishly thought they could manipulate. I turned to the final page of the letter. The handwriting was slightly weaker here, a quiet testament to her fading physical strength in those final days, but the profound love radiating from the ink remained incredibly powerful. You are safe now, my darling. The money inside this vault is clean. The properties are secure. You have absolute freedom to live the rest of your beautiful days in the warm Mediterranean sun. Walk along the coastline. Drink the wine from our own private vineyard. Breathe the fresh, uncorrupted air. Know that every single choice I made, every painful lie I told, was executed with the deepest, most profound love a woman can possibly possess for her husband. You gave me a wonderful life, Victor. Now I give you the rest of yours. Watch the fireworks from the balcony. Yours in this life and the next, Diana. I slowly folded the heavy parchment and placed it gently back into the cream envelope. The absolute silence of the climate-controlled study wrapped around me. I stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the staggering wealth my wife had masterfully preserved. The intricate layers of her brilliant foresight were laid bare, revealing a woman who loved me fiercely enough to carry the heaviest burden in absolute silence. The crushing, suffocating grief that had heavily anchored my soul for the past several weeks was entirely incinerated. It was completely replaced by a blinding, overwhelming sense of absolute awe and deeply profound gratitude. I walked back toward the massive iron door of the vault, my footsteps echoing with a renewed, powerful authority. I was no longer a discarded old man crying in a cheap motel. I was a king standing safely inside his castle, ready to watch his enemies burn. They thought they had buried me under the crushing weight of their immense greed. They were wrong. The absolute storm was coming for them, and I was safely entirely out of the rain. I carefully placed the handwritten pages back onto the velvet display pad. The heavy iron door of the antique vault remained open, a silent witness to the profound transformation taking place inside my chest. The suffocating grief that had defined my existence for the past month was completely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Diana had sacrificed her final days to weave an impenetrable shield around my life. I wiped a single remaining tear from my cheek, letting a slow, vicious smile spread across my face. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a survivor armed with the truth. I turned away from the stacks of bearer bonds and property deeds. I stepped out of the climate-controlled study and walked back down the long corridor of the chateau. The morning sun was pouring through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate tapestries and polished stone floors. I needed to establish immediate contact with Leon. My trusted head of security was the only person back in Chicago who fully understood the scale of the impending catastrophe. Antoine had thoughtfully placed a secure, encrypted satellite telephone on a small mahogany side table near the grand staircase. I picked it up. I walked out onto the sweeping stone balcony overlooking the sparkling Mediterranean Sea. The coastal breeze was warm and fragrant, a sharp contrast to the bitter winter wind currently battering the glass towers of Caldwell Real Estate. I dialed the private sequence of numbers Leon had provided me before I boarded the flight. The satellite connection hissed and popped for a fleeting moment before establishing a crystal-clear audio link. The line rang twice. Leon answered immediately, his deep voice tense and highly alert. He did not waste time with pleasantries or formal greetings. He knew time was strictly critical. "Victor," Leon said, the ambient noise of a busy street faintly echoing in the background. "I received this confirmation that your aircraft landed safely in Nice. You are entirely outside of American jurisdiction." I leaned against the stone balustrade, watching a white sailboat cut through the distant blue water. "I am safe, Leon," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. "Diana left me the key. I have seen the contents of the vault. I know absolutely everything about the $40 million syndicate debt. I need you to tell me exactly what is happening inside the corporate headquarters right now today. Leon exhaled a sharp breath. It is a complete bloodbath, Victor. Preston arrived at the office 3 hours ago. He attempted to access the private family trust accounts to cover a massive overdue interest payment demanded by the Shadow Syndicate. When he realized that the accounts had been entirely liquidated and legally separated from the corporate holdings, he lost his mind. He practically destroyed the executive boardroom. He knows the liquidity is gone. He knows the company is completely insolvent. He is currently trapped in a corner surrounded by $40 million of illegal debt with absolutely no exit strategy. I gripped the edge of the stone balcony. And what is his next move? I asked, though Diana's letter had already planted the dark seed of suspicion in my mind. Leon lowered his voice, the severity of the situation bleeding through the satellite connection. He is doing exactly what we feared, Victor. He is currently locked inside the primary executive suite with Declan and their corrupt internal counsel. I have active audio surveillance in that room. Preston is frantically forging your signature on the final syndicate loan documents. He is backdating the paperwork to make it look incredibly authentic today. The words hit me like a physical blow, despite the clear warnings Diana had written. My own son, the boy I had raised and mentored, was sitting at my former desk, actively fabricating evidence to frame me for his massive financial crimes. He is making me the fall guy. I stated the reality of the betrayal, solidifying into absolute certainty. Yes, Leon confirmed grimly. He is drafting a digital trail that points directly to you as the sole architect of the Shadow Ledgers. He plans to hand those forged documents to the cartel to save his own miserable life now. I closed my eyes, letting the warm French sun wash over my face. Any lingering trace of paternal, any small shred of hope that my children might eventually seek redemption evaporated in that exact second. They were not just greedy, they were ruthlessly malicious. They were fully prepared to sacrifice my freedom and my life to protect their stolen luxury. Preston was actively signing my death warrant, while Declan eagerly stood by and watched. A deep, profound sense of finality settled into my bones. I opened my eyes, staring out at the vast, totally uncaring Mediterranean Ocean below me. Declan is helping him. Leon continued feeding me the final pieces of their pathetic conspiracy. Declan is currently running the industrial shredders in the basement, destroying the genuine corporate tax filings. They are coordinating a narrative that you secretly authorized the syndicate loans before you fled the country due to your grief. They are using your sudden departure to France as supposed proof of your extreme guilt. They believe they have brilliantly outsmarted the system. They think they have successfully built the perfect scapegoat. I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed faintly against the ancient stone exterior walls. They are foolish, desperate men, I said softly, my voice carrying the lethal weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. They think they are playing a game of chess, but they do not realize the board has already been flipped. Leon listened to me very carefully. Diana compiled a highly encrypted digital dossier containing the genuine, unadulterated financial ledgers. She mapped the entire shadow banking structure, complete with IP addresses, offshore routing numbers, and undeniable proof of Preston's direct involvement. Do you currently have physical access to the transmission codes she left on the secure secondary corporate server now? I have absolutely everything, Leon replied instantly. The entire package is fully assembled and queued for immediate transmission. The digital dossier contains irrefutable evidence of the $40 million syndicate debt, the tax evasion algorithms, and the active forgery currently taking place in the executive suite. It is an absolute kill shot, Victor. Once I execute this command, there is absolutely no turning back. The federal authorities will descend on Caldwell Real Estate within the hour. The arrests will be immediate and highly public. The company you spent 40 years building will be completely dismantled. I await your final instruction. I looked down at the immaculate gardens of the chateau, completely serene and untouched by the venomous chaos across the Atlantic. Diana had been remarkably right. The $15 million corporation was nothing but a rotting shell. The true wealth was standing right here, completely secure and entirely clean. I pictured Preston sitting at my desk, desperately scribbling my name onto a fraudulent contract. I felt no sorrow, no hesitation, and no lingering regret. "Send the anonymous tip, Leon," I commanded, my voice cold, hard, and utterly final. "Give the FBI and the IRS absolutely everything. Let them burn." The satellite connection severed with a sharp click, leaving me entirely alone with the gentle sound of the Mediterranean waves crashing against the cliffs far below. I lowered the heavy receiver and placed it carefully back onto the polished mahogany table. The order was given. There was no reversing the sequence of events that Leon was now setting into motion across the Atlantic. I walked back out onto the sunlit balcony and gripped the warm stone railing. A profound stillness washed over my entire body. For the past several weeks, the crushing weight of grief and betrayal had severely suffocated me. But now, drawing the crisp, salty air deep into my lungs, I felt remarkably alive. I sat there, watching the white sails of distant boats drift across the horizon, waiting for the first tremors of the earthquake I had just unleashed upon my ungrateful sons. My encrypted cellular phone vibrated heavily in my pocket. The digital display illuminated with a secure notification from Leon. The message was incredibly brief, but it carried the destructive force of a hurricane. The data pack had been successfully transmitted to the federal authorities. The comprehensive shadow ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, the undeniable proof of the $40 million syndicate debt, and the active forgery attempts were now sitting squarely on the desks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The trap was sprung. The countdown to absolute ruin had officially begun. Less than an hour later, the relentless stream of live updates commenced. Leon had tapped into the internal security cameras of the Caldwell Real Estate headquarters, feeding the raw footage directly to a secure portal on my laptop. I sat at the glass desk inside the climate-controlled study, watching the beautiful destruction of a corrupt empire unfold in real time, in glorious high definition. The feed from the ground floor lobby flickered as a convoy of black tactical vehicles aggressively mounted the front curb of our Chicago high-rise. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and clearly marked windbreakers poured through the revolving glass doors. They moved with terrifying precision and overwhelming force. They bypassed the panicked security guards and immediately locked down the entire building. The elevators were seized and the stairwells were effectively blocked. No one was leaving. I switched the camera feed to the executive suite on the top floor. Preston was still sitting at my former desk, completely oblivious to the swarm of federal agents rapidly ascending the building. He was actively arguing with our corrupt internal counsel, Richard, over a stack of freshly forged loan documents. I watched the thick oak doors of the executive suite violently burst open. 6 armed agents stormed into the room with their weapons drawn, shouting commands that the silent video feed could not transmit, but that were unmistakably clear. Preston physically recoiled, knocking his heavy leather chair backward as he threw his hands into the air. The sheer terror distorting his face was incredibly satisfying to witness. He had believed he was a brilliant mastermind, untouchable and superior to the father who had given him everything. Now he was nothing more than a pathetic, frightened criminal caught entirely red-handed. The agents slammed him face down onto the polished mahogany desk, violently twisting his arms behind his back. The steel handcuffs flashed under the bright fluorescent lights. Richard attempted to quietly slide a crucial folder into his leather briefcase, but an agent quickly intercepted him, slamming him against the glass wall. I watched as they dragged my eldest son and his corrupt lawyer out of the executive suite, in chains, parading them past rows of utterly shocked employees. The corporate kingdom Preston had desperately coveted was forcefully stripped from him in a matter of minutes. The phone vibrated once again, vibrating against the smooth glass surface of the desk. Leon was providing simultaneous updates on my younger son. Declan had entirely avoided the morning corporate meetings, choosing instead to host a lavish midday party on his newly acquired luxury yacht, anchored down in Miami. He had purchased the vessel using the diverted funds he believed were safely hidden from federal scrutiny. He was currently celebrating his supposed inheritance, entirely unaware that his older brother was being aggressively hauled into a federal detention center. Leon forwarded a brief audio intercept gathered from local Marine Band radio frequencies. The United States Coast Guard, accompanied by a heavily armed tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had rapidly intercepted Declan, just 2 miles off the sunny Florida coastline. Heavily armed patrol boats had aggressively swarmed the massive floating palace, ordering all engines to be immediately cut. I pictured the utter chaos unfolding on the sun-drenched deck. Declan always played the careless playboy, believing his immense wealth shielded him from genuine consequences. I imagined his wealthy, superficial friends screaming in absolute panic as federal agents forcefully boarded the yacht, demanding total compliance. The authorities seized the vessel under immediate asset forfeiture laws, directly linking the extravagant purchase to the fraudulent corporate funds outlined in Diana's master dossier. Declan was publicly arrested while wearing his expensive designer swimwear, stripped of his arrogant pride, and dragged away in front of his elite social circle. He would undoubtedly spend his evening sitting inside a cold, miserable holding cell, completely isolated from the luxurious lifestyle he had so selfishly stolen from his own family. The rapid collapse of their stolen kingdom was not strictly limited to the boys. A secondary alert arrived from my private banking portal, confirming the precise execution of the minor trap I had set before departing the airport lounge. Monica, the incredibly superficial wife of Preston, had spent her afternoon wandering the exclusive shopping districts of downtown Chicago, completely blind to the catastrophic ruin currently consuming her husband. The banking notification revealed that she had confidently attempted to charge a staggering $22,000 at a high-end designer boutique for a collection of luxury leather goods. I smiled deeply as I read the automated transaction report. The payment was aggressively declined. The bank teller system immediately flagged the secondary black card as permanently revoked. I could vividly picture the scene unfolding within the pristine, brightly lit boutique. Monica would have sneered at the polite sales associate, demanding they run the black card a second time, loudly declaring her immense wealth and untouchable status to anyone listening. The machine would decline the magnetic strip once again, leaving her standing in complete humiliation. She would reach for her phone, desperately dialing Preston to demand an immediate fix to this incredibly embarrassing inconvenience. But Preston would not answer her desperate calls because he was currently surrendering his personal belongings to a federal intake officer. Her perfect wealthy illusion had instantly evaporated, leaving her stranded in a luxury boutique with absolutely nothing to her name. The immense financial well she had carelessly drained for years had finally run completely dry. I leaned back into the plush leather chair and gently closed my eyes, deeply savoring the absolute brilliant silence of the vault. The fraudulent empire was finally dead. The justice was perfect. I carried my glass of 50-year-old scotch out onto the sprawling stone balcony. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent over the Mediterranean Sea, painting the sky in brilliant shades of crushed violet and burnt orange. The gentle sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocky cliffs far below provided a soothing, natural symphony. I took a slow sip of the scotch, letting the complex, smoky warmth burn pleasantly inside. For the first time in 40 years, my mind was completely disconnected from the relentless, grinding machinery of the American corporate world. I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for Diana and the brilliant protective fortress she had secretly built to save my life. Just as I raised my glass to offer a silent, solitary toast, the profound tranquility of the evening was abruptly shattered. Deep inside the pocket of my tailored trousers, a small encrypted burner phone began to vibrate violently. Leon had provided this specific device to me precisely for emergency untraceable communications. I slowly lowered my glass and pulled the dark plastic phone from my pocket. The digital screen illuminated with an incoming international call routed through a heavily masked proxy server. I stood motionless on the balcony. I had survived the worst betrayal of my entire life and emerged completely victorious. I was finally untouchable. The caller identification was completely scrambled, just as Leon had designed it. I took one final breath before answering. I pressed the green button and raised the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited in the silence. The connection crackled fiercely with the chaotic overlapping sounds of absolute destruction. Even across thousands of miles of ocean, the sheer panic transmitting through the small speaker was undeniably vivid. I heard the deafening shriek of police sirens wailing in the background, overlapping with the harsh, authoritative shouts of federal agents securing a perimeter. I heard heavy boots slamming against polished marble floors and the distinct, terrifying sound of glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. Then I heard a voice. It was a pathetic, ragged sound, entirely stripped of the smug arrogance that had defined my eldest son for the past decade. Preston was violently sobbing. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as if he were physically drowning. The confident corporate shark, who had cruelly betrayed his own father, was completely gone forever. In his place was a terrified, broken child begging for a lifeline he absolutely did not deserve. I stood motionless, listening to his frantic, unstructured weeping as the massive federal raid dismantled his stolen empire completely. "Dad, Dad," he screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "Dad, please tell me you are there. Please, you have to help us. The IRS is here. The FBI is here. They are tearing the building apart." I took another slow, deliberate sip of the vintage scotch, savoring the rich, earthy flavor as it coated my tongue. I remained perfectly silent, letting his panic echo against the quiet coastal wind. "Dad, did you hear me?" he cried out desperately. "They are kicking down the doors. They have Declan in custody down in Miami. They seized his boat. They are arresting everyone. The entire executive board is in handcuffs. We are losing everything. The company is completely underwater. We are $40 million in debt to a shadow syndicate. You have to save us. You have to wire us money right now. Please, Dad, I am begging you." His confession poured out in a frantic, pathetic rush immediately over the secure connection. I was freely admitting to the massive illegal debts, believing I was completely ignorant of his monumental failures. He genuinely thought I was still the blind, trusting father who would blindly sacrifice his own safety to rescue his ungrateful children today. I stared out at the fading violet light of the sunset. I felt absolutely no pity for the weeping man on the other end of the line. I felt no parental urge to comfort him or offer him sanctuary. Preston paused his frantic rambling to suck in a ragged, desperate breath. Then he uttered the words that permanently sealed his dark fate. "Dad," he sobbed, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "It was Mom. Mom set us up. She faked her illness. She faked the dementia. She deliberately separated the family trust accounts and completely drained the corporate cash reserves before she died. She knowingly left us with a toxic shell. She framed us. She sent the ledgers to the federal agents. You have to believe me. She is the reason we are going to federal prison. You have to call your international bankers. You have to wire the private pension funds to my offshore account immediately tonight. I can pay the syndicate before they send someone to kill me. You are the only one who can fix this. Please, Dad. You have to save your sons from this absolute nightmare right now. I am pleading with you." My grip on the crystal glass tightened until my knuckles turned completely white. He had actively destroyed the company he had stolen our legacy, and he was currently attempting to forge my signature to frame me for his massive federal crimes. Yet in his final desperate moment of absolute ruin, he still had the sheer cowardly audacity to blame his own mother. He was actively cursing the brilliant woman who had died quietly to protect me from his monstrous greed. The absolute cowardice of his statement finally broke my silence. I spoke into the receiver. My voice was incredibly calm, smooth, and completely devoid of any emotion. It was the icy, detached tone of an executioner reading a final verdict. "I know exactly what your mother did, Preston," I said softly. "I know she brilliantly isolated the true wealth of our family. I know she secured the European bonds and built a magnificent stone fortress to completely protect me today. And I know she sent the anonymous tip to the federal authorities to ensure you finally faced the brutal consequences of your own disastrous actions. She did not frame you, my pathetic son. She entirely exposed you." The telephone line went completely dead silent save for the wailing sirens in the distant Chicago background. Preston stopped sobbing, his breath catching in his throat, as the horrifying reality of my words slowly fractured his remaining sanity. "You knew," he whispered, his voice hollow and completely broken. "Yes, I knew absolutely everything," I replied smoothly. "I know about the $40 million syndicate debt. I know you mortgaged our pristine reputation to fund your arrogant lifestyle. I know you are currently sitting in the executive suite, desperately trying to forge my signature on fraudulent loan documents to make me the fall guy. You thought you could sacrifice my freedom to save your own miserable skin. You thought I was a clueless old man waiting to die in obscurity. You were wrong. I am standing on the balcony of a beautiful French estate, looking at the ocean. My funds are secure. You have nothing. Do not ever call me again." I disconnected forever. The heavy plastic of the burner phone had barely left my ear before it began to vibrate violently against my palm once again. Preston was calling back. He was desperately refusing to accept the reality of the black void he had just stepped into. I looked down at the glowing screen, watching the scrambled international number flash repeatedly. Part of me considered simply throwing the device over the edge of the stone balcony right then and there. I had already delivered the truth. I had already informed him that his entire criminal structure had collapsed. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades meticulously building a legacy, only to watch my own flesh and blood try to tear it apart, demanded absolute closure. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear one last time. Preston did not even wait for me to speak. He was practically screaming, his voice a ragged, breathless panic that echoed with the distinct sounds of federal agents physically breaching the heavy wooden doors of the executive suite. "Dad, please!" he wailed, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his arrogant corporate persona. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot just leave me here to take the fall. I am your son, Declan, and I are your blood. You have to wire the money. They are putting handcuffs on Richard right now. They are pointing weapons at us. You have to call your Swiss bankers and authorize the transfer. Save us, please. I am begging you." I stood on the beautiful sunlit balcony, feeling the warm Mediterranean breeze brush against my face. I looked out over the vast, sparkling expanse of the ocean. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands remained perfectly steady. I did not feel the sudden urge to yell or scream at the pathetic creature weeping on the other end of the line. I did not feel the need to gloat over my magnificent victory. The profound sense of justice Diana had engineered for us required no theatrical shouting. It required only the cold, hard delivery of undeniable truth. My voice, when I finally spoke, was entirely smooth, completely indifferent, and dripping with a quiet, lethal irony. "I am sorry, Preston," I said, letting the absolute calm of my tone contrast sharply with the chaotic background noise of his impending arrest. "I would truly love to help you right now, but I am just a clueless old man who does not understand business. I am far too senile to navigate the complexities of international wire transfers or syndicate debt negotiations. Besides, you explicitly asked me to disappear from this family forever. I am just respecting your wishes. I did not wait for his reply. I did not wait to hear his final scream of realization, or the harsh commands of the federal agents aggressively throwing him against the mahogany desk. I removed the phone from my ear and pressed the red button terminating the connection with a soft, definitive click. The silence that followed was immediate and glorious. I held the cheap plastic phone in both of my hands. I dug my thumb under the edge of the back casing and pried it open. The small rectangular battery fell onto the stone floor of the balcony. I reached into the exposed circuitry and carefully extracted the tiny gold-plated SIM card. This tiny piece of plastic and metal was the very last remaining tether to my former life in Chicago. It was the final digital thread connecting me to the corruption, the betrayal, and the agonizing grief of the past year. I held the small card between my thumb and forefinger. With a single sharp motion, I snapped it completely in half. The plastic cracked crisply. I stepped forward until I was leaning directly over the edge of the stone balustrade. The jagged cliffs dropped steeply down to the dark blue waves crashing rhythmically against the rocks far below. I opened my hand and let the broken pieces of the SIM card fall. I watched them flutter silently through the warm evening air, catching the fading sunlight for a brief moment before they vanished entirely into the churning Mediterranean waters. The ocean swallowed them without a sound, erasing Preston Declan and the toxic remains of Caldwell real estate from my existence forever. I turned my back to the sea and looked at the magnificent chateau Diana had secured for our salvation. The warm glow of the interior lights began to illuminate the tall, arched windows as the evening approached. I walked back inside, leaving the balcony behind. The climate-controlled study was just as quiet and secure as I had left it. The massive antique vault stood open, a silent guardian of the true legacy we had built. I walked past the glass desk and exited into the grand hallway. Antoine was waiting discreetly at the bottom of the sweeping marble staircase. He stood with his hands neatly folded behind his back, projecting an aura of absolute professionalism and unwavering loyalty. As I descended the stairs, he bowed his head respectfully. "Monsieur Caldwell," Antoine said smoothly, "I have instructed the culinary staff to prepare a light evening meal for you. It will be served on the western terrace whenever you are ready. I also took the liberty of unpacking your travel bag and preparing the master suite." "Thank you, Antoine," I replied, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the sanctuary this man helped maintain. "The western terrace sounds absolutely perfect. I will join you there shortly." I walked through the opulent corridors of the estate, my footsteps echoing softly against the imported stone floors. I entered the master suite. It was a sprawling, beautifully appointed room featuring vaulted ceilings, rich silk draperies, and a massive set of French doors that opened onto a private garden. On the polished wooden nightstand next to the enormous bed, I saw a familiar silver picture frame. I walked over and picked it up. It was a photograph of Diana and me, taken nearly 30 years ago during a vacation in Tuscany. She was laughing, her bright eyes filled with a fierce, brilliant intelligence. I traced the edge of the silver frame with my thumb. She had foreseen the terrible storm long before the first dark clouds had ever formed. I set the silver frame back onto the nightstand. The crushing, heavy sorrow that had defined my life since her passing was entirely gone. I did not feel grief anymore. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. The justice she had designed was absolute and perfect. Preston and Declan were currently experiencing the terrifying reality of federal custody. They would spend the next several decades locked inside concrete cells, stripped of their arrogant pride and their stolen luxury. They would have entirely nothing but time to reflect on the magnificent deception their mother had executed right under their noses. I walked out onto the open terrace to watch the dark waves. I smiled into the wind. The quiet, beautiful masterpiece was finally finished, and our absolute victory was now completely and entirely perfect in every single imaginable way. The golden sun hung low over the hills of Provence, casting long, elegant shadows across the rows of my private vineyard. I walked slowly through the dust, feeling the crunch of dry earth beneath my boots, a stark and grounding contrast to the polished marble of the Chicago office I had vacated forever. The air here was heavy with the scent of ripening grapes and the promise of a harvest I would finally see come to fruition under a sky that belonged only to me. It was a profound, quiet luxury to walk these acres without the weight of corporate espionage or the suffocating presence of sycophants trailing my every move. The brutal justice of the universe had settled its accounts with clinical, terrifying efficiency. My sons had spent years maneuvering to replace me, trading the sanctity of family for the promise of unearned wealth. They had looked at their father, a man who had spent 40 years building a legacy from nothing and seen only an obstacle to be discarded. They viewed my wisdom as senility and my caution as weakness. They had been so consumed by their own shallow ambitions that they failed to notice the trap they were walking into, a trap woven with the very greed that had corrupted their souls. They sought a kingdom of hollow glass and debt, and in their feverish haste to seize it, they successfully forged the bars of their own iron cages. There was a cold, symmetrical beauty to it all. I reached the end of the main row, where the land sloped gently toward the manor house. I stopped to run my hand along the rough bark of an old vine, thinking of Preston and Declan. They would spend the next decade or more within the monochromatic walls of a federal penitentiary, listening to the echoing clatter of metal doors rather than the cheers of corporate boardrooms. They would have endless, silent hours to contemplate the precise moment their arrogance began to dictate their undoing. They had wanted to be masters of the universe, but they ended up merely as inmates of their own making. It was not a tragedy. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life built upon the shifting sands of malice and deceit. I made my way back to the terrace, where a small iron table stood waiting beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree. Antoine had already prepared everything exactly as I preferred. A crystal decanter of dark, rich wine breathed in the cooling air, and 2 fine glasses caught the fading light of the day. I pulled out a chair, the metal scraping softly against the stone, and sat down. From my pocket, I produced the small, silver-framed photograph of Diana. Her gaze was as sharp and intelligent in the picture as it had been the day we stood at the altar. She had been the architect of our salvation, the silent strategist who saw the darkness in our children's hearts long before I was willing to acknowledge it. I poured the wine, the deep crimson liquid swirling gracefully into the glasses. The silence of the eight was absolute save for the distant song of cicadas and the faint rustle of leaves. I slid the second glass toward the photograph, positioning it perfectly. In this quiet corner of the world, I felt her presence not as a ghost, but as a guiding force. She had sacrificed her reputation, her health, and her final months of vitality to ensure that I was not sacrificed on the altar of our son's avarice. She had played the part of the fading, confused matron so perfectly that even I had been fooled, a performance that undoubtedly cemented her place as the most formidable person I have ever known. I lifted my glass, the cool crystal firm in my hand. I looked into the photo, tracing the familiar curve of her smile and the depth of her eyes. I took a slow, thoughtful sip, the wine earthy and bold, reflecting the land we now truly owned. There were no more threats to neutralize, no more shadow syndicates to outmaneuver, and no more internal alarms to silence. The world was small, manageable, and entirely mine. The power I held here was not the frantic, fragile authority of a CEO presiding over a crumbling firm. It was the quiet, absolute power of a man who owned his own destiny and owed nothing to anyone. I set my glass back on the table with a soft clink. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, bathing the terrace in a soft twilight blue. I felt a sense of clarity that I had not known in decades. The frantic pace of my former life, the constant anxiety of corporate warfare, and the dull, persistent ache of being systematically underestimated had all been burned away, leaving behind only the distilled essence of contentment. I looked up at the stars, beginning to puncture the velvet sky, realizing that I was, for the first time, untouchable. My freedom was not merely physical. It was the intellectual and emotional liberation that came from having looked into the abyss of betrayal and having the conviction to walk away without a backward glance. "Well played, my queen," I whispered into the cool evening air. My voice was a soft murmur, but it carried the weight of a final, satisfied vow. She had won. We had won. The boys had been dismantled, their hubris dismantled along with their fortunes, and I was left standing in the wreckage whole and entirely at peace. There was no bitterness in my reflection, only a clean, surgical acknowledgement of the truth. I had given them every advantage, every tool, and every opportunity to be better men, and they had chosen the path of least resistance. That choice had led them to their current miserable reality, a destination I no longer had any obligation to alter. I looked at the house, a monument to a life of hard-won victory. Every stone, every beam, and every acre of this vineyard was proof of our labor, now purified of the toxic influence of the next generation. I would spend the rest of my day in the soft Mediterranean sun, surrounded by the silence of my own choosing. I would read, I would observe, and I would exist without the fear of what might be happening behind my back in an executive office. The trust I had placed in others was dead, but in its place I had found a deeper, more permanent reliance upon my own judgment and the enduring legacy of the woman who had loved me enough to let the world burn so that I might find my way to safety. The wind picked up, rustling the olive branches and carrying the cool scent of the sea. I reached out and touched the frame one last time, my fingers lingering on the cold metal. It was a perfect ending to a chapter I had once feared would be my undoing. I settled back into the chair, content to let the darkness settle around me, knowing that when I woke up tomorrow, there would be no calls from worried security heads and no threats from my children. There would only be the morning light, the quiet earth, and the absolute unwavering certainty that I had outlived my enemies and claimed the peace that was rightfully mine. The game was over, and I had exited the board completely on my own terms. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the night, knowing that for the first time in 40 years I was finally truly free.